Welcome and thank you all for standing by. At this time, all participants will be in a listen-only mode until the question and answer portion of today's conference. During the question and answer session, please limit yourself to one question. If you would like to queue up again, you may do so. To queue up for questions, you may use *1 on your phone. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn today's call over to Mr. Josh Finch. You may begin.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's update from the independent review team that's been looking at Boeing's orbital flight test as a part of NASA's Commercial Crew Program. Here with me today to talk more about the IR team findings, we have Doug Lavero, Associate Administrator of NASA's Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate, Kathy Leaders, Manager of NASA's Commercial Crew Program, Jim Chilton, Senior Vice President at Boeing Space and Launch, and John Mulholland, Vice President and Manager of Boeing's CST-100 Starliner program. We're going to begin with opening comments from each of our speakers and then have time for questions and answers after that. So I'll kick it off with Mr. Lavero.
Thank you, Josh, and welcome everybody to the telecon today. Thank you for all tuning in to this today. We're going to try to go ahead and use today to close out our what we have been doing over the last several months since the OFT test that we had back in December. First of all, before I start, I want to make sure I do one thing, because I want to thank the Boeing team and Jim Chilton. Thank you so much for the work that you and your team have done on this entire incident. Losing my voice. The team worked very hard, both the cooperative joint team between NASA and Boeing, and they came out with about 60 corrective actions that we are going to work through over the next several months in order to go ahead and make sure that when we decide to fly again, we can fly safely. We at NASA have done several things that you all know about. Number one, as we announced, I think it was in our last telecon, we announced that we would do an organizational safety assessment with Boeing. Boeing has graciously agreed to go ahead and support that organizational safety assessment, and that will be kicking off sometime very soon, so that we can go ahead and understand if there are any underlying issues that we need to know about for Boeing. We have the 60 corrective actions, as I've already said, that we will be working through in a disciplined manner to go ahead and make sure that we can safely understand what happened and how to correct it. I have decided to go ahead with all of the evidence and all of the hindsight that we have now since the actual OFT. I have decided to go ahead and do something within NASA that we call issuing a high visibility close call for the OFT flight. This is a procedural issue within NASA that allows us to go ahead and capture in a formal way the lessons that we learned from this flight, and allows us to go ahead and do what we call an organizational root cause assessment, which means we're going to look at both Boeing's organizational processes and NASA's organizational processes in order to go ahead and make sure we truly do learn from this event and that we know how to fix it and make sure it does not happen again. That activity will kick off upon me signing a letter later today that asks our organizational safety folks to begin that process, and we will assign a team from outside of HEO, my directorate, in order to go ahead and do the work. All of this is intended to go ahead and make sure that we have taken all of the proper precautions and procedures necessary to make it possible for us to have a dependable transportation to the space station through the Starliner. So I want to go ahead and once again thank all the work that's been done by our team down at Kennedy. Kathy Leaders and her team have done a great job. Jim Chilton and his team have done a great job. I'd like to especially point out the work done by one of Jim's folks, General retired Sam Greaves. Sam led the IRT on his side, and I've known Sam for, most of my adult life, and I believe they've done an excellent job at figuring out all of the things that led to this incident and recommended actions to go forward. With that, I will go ahead and turn the mic back over to Kathy and let her go ahead and give opening statements.
Thank you, Doug. So first, I also really appreciate the dedication and the thoroughness of the joint NASA-Boeing Independent Review Team. You know, their insights were specific, and they had key recommendations that have been very, very helpful to both John and myself. It is always good to have fresh eyes on the problem. Second, we have listened to their recommendations, and we are taking concrete corrective steps to move forward to improve for the next mission. I'll let John talk through his corrective actions. But on the NASA side, the things that we have done include adding a focused NASA software lead, embedding more software experts in the Boeing software development process, working with Boeing on adding NASA IVMV, and then working together to beef up our SE&I oversight and integration into Boeing's integration activities. And I really appreciate Boeing kind of reaching out and working with us jointly to go make these improvements. Third, we will continue to welcome feedback during our continued progress toward flight over these next few months, and will incorporate, obviously, any suggestions coming from additional review teams or really any other folks in the agency or within Boeing that think that are helping us do better, right? We are not only doing this to look back, but we're also applying this learning into our steps moving forward. And as Doug always talks about, making sure that we have the right software, hardware to conduct our next important mission. Thank you.
And now we'll go to Jim Chilton from Boeing.
Okay, thanks everyone for your interest and for joining today. I'll just start by echoing gratitude for the NASA and Boeing IRT members. I know they work long hours. I know it's not easy to dig into complicated problems. They were assembled quickly and had to make some calls on the fly about who should join them and how to get data. So I don't think anybody should underestimate the difficulty of their task. I'm grateful for their help, and especially to NASA for doing this jointly, shoulder to shoulder, and being, candid about what you'd like to see. I would like to just, I need to do this for my Boeing team. I'd like to commend them on their cooperation, candidness, opening up, saying, here's what I was thinking, here's why it didn't work, being very clear with the IRT about all our mission data and testing and what our intent was and how those things worked out. So to the Boeing team, thanks for doing that. We're going to continue to do it. This has been nothing but a positive exercise for us. So thank you, NASA, and thank the Boeing team. A little bit about what the results of the IRT were. We're tracking about 61 actions, but lots of other good advice. We plan to fully incorporate all of that. And I think it's important to say that we plan to keep members of the IRT, we ask them to stick around a little bit or at least stay on speed dial. It's important to remember that we went into this flight and the predecessor worked to the flight with a test plan. We had all agreed to that plan and we executed the plan, and it wasn't good enough. So it's possible, as we take all the work and findings from the IRT and the other things NASA and ourselves discovered to do on top of that, that we'll need to keep eyes on the plan and make sure we still like it, and that people like the IRT members can make sure it works for us. So, there was a clear plan to go execute. We executed it, and we didn't learn everything we wanted to learn, so we're grateful to the IRT to kind of stay on speed dial and stick around with us. And so the last thing I'll say is I hope everybody can take away from today the great work that's been done by the IRT and the fact that it's going to get us back to flying with the best possible spacecraft we can put our crews in. And whatever testing we've got to do to make that happen, we embrace it, and we're grateful for the help. our people, our country, and our astronauts don't deserve anything less than the base spacecraft we can field. So, although I must say, the organizational assessment Doug described is emergent to Boeing. We don't know about it. We embrace it. We want to hear from you. We want to look at more than the safety assessment. If you have observations that can make us stronger, count us in.
And we'll go to John Mulholland.
All right, thank you. Very briefly, I'd just like to reiterate the compliments to our team throughout this entire process. They have demonstrated complete professionalism, and they're very open and dedicated to the corrections that we need to do to make this right. I'd also like to reiterate the compliments to the IRT. They have been extremely comprehensive and thorough in their review. They have identified within those 61 actions different themes, both organizational and technical. And our team is off moving forward on implementation of all of those recommendations. And as a couple of examples, one I talked about last week, one of the first steps that we have to go do is an audit from the software requirements through the testing that was performed to qualify that software. First step in verifying the software is identify if you had any gaps in testing. That team has gone off and completed the audit on all the high, medium, and most of the low complexity logic strings within the software. Have identified about 49 gaps in testing. That doesn't correspond to 49 errors, but that is 49 gaps in testing that now our team will be able to go perform that testing and identify whether there's any additional corrupt code. And if so, we'll be able to fix it. So it's incredibly important to get to the point where you understand any additional problems so that you can move forward and ensure that you have good code. A number of other items were organizational. We are making those changes where necessary to ensure that we have a robust system, and also to make sure we institutionalize the learning so that it will stay with the team over the long term. Things like board structure, ensuring that we drive a better and more thorough systems engineering across the entire work scope that we have. And ensuring that we have more detailed process documents that define exactly the tests that need to be conducted, the reviews that need to happen, the hardware configuration in the labs, and then the teams that need to review all of the data and sign off on it. We believe that completion of all these will ensure that we have a robust solution moving forward. As I mentioned last week, the team is moving forward. We are developing and implementing all of the work plans to robustly address all of the IRT actions. In the factory, the spacecraft processing and refurbishment is continuing. Our engineering team is hard at work, completing all of the work scope that's on their plate. And we are confident in the ability to return to flight safely when our team and NASA is ready to do so. Thank you.
And now we'll begin the question and answer portion. And I'll turn it over to the operator for a reminder of how to get into the queue if you're not already. If you could, remember to state your name and affiliation and to whom you're directing your question. And then for our speakers, if someone else is going to jump in and answer a different question, if you could state your name as well for the media that are dialed in so they know who's talking at that point. And I'll turn it over to the operator.
Thank you. We would now like to open lines for any questions. If anyone does have a question, please hit *1 and record your name when prompted. Again, that's *1 to ask a question. And remember, please limit yourself to one question only. Our first question is from Keith Cowing from NASAWatch.com. Your line is open.
Hi, this is for the Boeing guys. I'm going to let my colleagues ask all the obvious questions about launches and so forth. Listening to the fact that there were 60-plus problems on a spacecraft that was developed for years and it cost billions of dollars is a little startling to me, and I've been covering NASA for a quarter of a century. Boeing not only builds Starliner, but they also build the SLS. Given all the problems that happened in what was supposed to be an operational spacecraft, how can Boeing assure NASA and the public that the SLS, another space vehicle that you're building, will not be similarly plagued with, oh my God, we didn't think about that problems?
Okay, this is Jim Chilton. Thanks, Keith. I think the first question was 61 problems. My understanding of the IRT recommendations, there are 61 recommendations that don't map to 61 design issues, but they're all parsed out to be very actionable. So I don't know that I could comment on 61 design problems. On the larger question about SLS, we took those 61 actions and we have built a learning package in collaborating with NASA, and we're going out not only to Boeing programs, but NASA is taking it to frankly, our industry colleagues and competitors, and we're just going to make sure the whole space ecosystem can learn from what we learned here, without them having to dig too deep or ask in crazy ways. We're just trying to here's the key learnings, here's the assumptions our team made that now we know they shouldn't have made, and some of the decisions we made in designing our tests. So, number one, I'm not tracking 61 design changes, and I guess I could ask John if he knows better. I don't think there were 61 findings. There were 61 ways to get better in 3 categories. And then second, we're distributing the learning as broadly as possible and not just within Boeing.
And Jim, let me
Next, we have Michael Sheets. Your line is open.
I think things might have gotten dropped a little bit here, but I wanted to ask about the recommendations. And Jim spoke to this a little bit on how they don't necessarily cross-apply to issues. So I'm curious how many issues that Boeing is tracking, and if in those recommendations you include a recommendation to fly another uncrewed flight test.
Please stand by. We are having technical difficulties. Again, please stand by. We are having technical audio difficulties. Thank you. Again, please stand by. We are having audio technical difficulties. Thank you. Again, please continue to hold. Again, please stand by. The conference will begin again momentarily. Thank you. Again, please stand by. The conference will begin again momentarily. Back in there. And you guys are back in conference.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for staying on the line. I'm going to go back over to Doug Lavera, who I believe was answering part of the question. So I'll go back over to Doug, and then we'll get right back into question and answers.
Yeah, so I apologize. I don't know where you all lost us during my answer. I was answering. I was adding on to the answer that Jim Chilton gave to Keith Cowing on the question about crossover to SLS. And as I said, Keith, I hope you can hear me now. Great question. You know, this the first thing we did was to look at this issue and figure out where we had overlap. Jim Chilton and his team agreed to go ahead and provide us a non-proprietary version of the IRT reports. Our structure within SLS is obviously different than the structure within Starliner. In Starliner, Boeing owns the entire stack. In SLS, Boeing owns the booster, Lockheed owns obviously the Orion capsule, and NASA owns the integration. So we're the ones who are charged with integrating those together. So it's not just a matter of sharing the lessons from Starliner with the Boeing people working on SLS, or the Lockheed people who are working on Orion. It's also sharing it with the NASA folks who are working the integration between the two. So we are making sure that we look across all of those teams and across all of our NASA teams to make sure we don't have similar issues as we discovered on OFT. So that's a great question, because it really does make sure that we are focusing on that issue. Thank you.
And we have Michael Sheets from CNBC. Your line is open.
Hi, all. I tried to get my question in there earlier. Sorry about the technical difficulties. But I had asked for clarification on the recommendations, first of all, because Jim had mentioned those recommendations aren't necessarily 61 issues, and I'm wondering how many specific issues from the flight that Boeing and NASA are tracking that they would like to address. And in that, secondarily, does one of the recommendations include conducting another uncrewed flight test, or will the next flight test be crewed?
Hi, this is John Mulholland to address that. The IRT specifically addressed 3 issues: the 2 software issues, and then the communications issue. And it is a real compliment to the thoroughness of the IRT. So those were the 3 issues that they addressed. Sometimes IRTs come in with very high-level recommendations. We asked that team, and they were very prescriptive, so that those actions could be more easily absorbed, planned, and implemented. Last week in the conference that I had, I went through all of the systems, all the positive findings that we had across the spacecraft and launch vehicle hardware, and also a couple of the other findings that we had that were pretty benign. One of those was on one of the CM prop line zones, we had we were getting a little bit colder, not down to the level where we could have had a problem, but we were colder than our pretest predictions, and so we're going to add some additional heater lines in that area. But largely the performance of the spacecraft beyond those three specific issues was very good.
Hey, Mike. Mike, this is Doug Lavero. Let me jump in on that. I mean, so John is correct that there were three primary issues that we asked the IRT to do. But when you start uncovering those things, obviously there are other issues that aren't necessarily technical or design issues. They're process issues. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that there are only three things that we had to have findings about. I don't know what the full number of individual issues I would consider, and it's hard to count them up because do you consider a process issue and software a separate issue, or is that still the software issue? So I don't know that we have a count of all of the individual things that we could find and which ones we would consider an issue as opposed to an observation. So if I could not answer that part of the question, number one, because I don't know the answer, and number two, because I think it's much in the eye of the beholder as to what an issue is. But let me, if I could, address the second part of your question, which is will we require a test flight? Quite frankly, right now we don't know. The findings and the corrective actions that Boeing has laid out, they have to now come back to NASA with a plan of how they're going to go ahead and address all of those. That plan will have a schedule. It will have all of the technical aspects to it. It'll have all the details of when and how they're going to go ahead and address them. And then NASA will evaluate that plan. We'll evaluate the results of their work. We will do our own inspection of the results of their work. And then we'll be in a position to decide whether or not we need another test flight or not. So we are still a ways away from that, and I can't even tell you what the schedule is for making that decision because it's very dependent upon what we see as Boeing's corrective action plan and the thoroughness by which we believe that correction action plan has been implemented.
Thank you. Next, we have Chris Davenport from the Washington Post. Your line is open.
Hey, thanks, guys. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. I wonder on the 61 corrective actions, I don't want you to list all of them, but I wonder if you might single out a few of the more significant ones just so we can get a sense of what are in those recommendations. Thanks.
Oh, so I'll get started and John can help me fill in. I mean, I think there was kind of like three important areas. One was really looking at how to fix the kind of the specific software issues that were involved in the anomalies that we've laid out before. You know, what we talked about, we had the issue with the mission elapsed time going up, and then we had the issue with the SM, the service module, deorbit burn coming down, and obviously the team's got to go in and fix those specific issues, right? And so very focused area, fixing the code and understanding why were there issues, those issues not caught all the way through, right? In addition, you know, when you're going and fixing a specific area's code, then you go, and like John's talked about before, you go and look at, okay, how do we do our software testing? How do we understand, you know, obviously we had these code errors come through. What were the contributing causes to those code errors coming through? And so the, three key areas that they then focused on was, how do I improve the testing? So John already talked about looking at really how code is tested and then the test environments that they're in. Do we have the right boxes, the hardware and software testing in place? Do we have the right stressing cases in place? There's a bunch of different suggestions on that, right? And then we've talked a lot about systems engineering, making sure that the hardware and software teams are working together to better understand the results of the code and make sure the code's doing what they're expecting, but then also understanding when people make choices about testing all the time and having the engineering focus also assess that where those choices and what's being tested, making sure that we're understanding and understanding how that testing is going to really wring out the code. And then the third area is making sure that the code itself is done correctly. So ICDs, and that any hardware design changes are implemented into this overall design process. So kind of reiterating again, the 4 categories. The first category is like fixing the specific errors that were made. And then the other 3 categories are kind of on addressing how do we make sure that the different building blocks that were in place to build the code, test the code, and then final verification of the code are fixed so that we don't have that we don't have these kinds of errors again in the future. And so the key NASA adds are added into those 4 specific areas too, to make sure that as a joint team we're working together to assess the products that were already built, assess the testing that was already done, and then make sure that the code and the process going forward are fixed. And I'll let John, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that was well stated. Thanks.
Let me, Kathy and John, this is Doug, let me add a couple of things. Chris, you asked for some specifics, so I want to make sure you get some specifics. So let me give you 2 specific things that will, I think, give you, are all included in exactly what Kathy said, but it allows you to understand how you break that down to more specific facts. So one thing we discovered with the IRT is that where we had a routine where there may have been 4 logical conditions, in other words, there were 4 ways the software could have run. We didn't test all 4 logical conditions. Why that didn't happen is it was a choice for the designers and the testers, and it's not unusual that you don't test every logical condition in software, but we clearly recognize that we do need to go and test every logical condition. So we are going back in and making sure that the test covers every logical state of the software that we can have. That's sort of a technical side of it. There's a process side of it. One of the things that the IRT and Jim Chilton's team identified is that we had delegated too much authority to the software board to approve changes and to approve actions as it applied to software. And to Kathy's larger point about software hardware integration, those changes should have been brought up to the overall engineering review board, which is a standard process in any engineering organization, should have been brought up all the way to make sure that we coordinated that with them before those processes were approved. Those are the 2, for example, specific elements, subcategories of the 4 major elements that Kathy had. So we've reduced all of the issues down to those specific kind of things that we can articulate. Some of them are very complicated to discuss, but it's those kind of things. So hopefully that gives you an idea of those general areas that Kathy's talking about.
Thank you. Next, we have Irene Klotz from Aviation Week. Your line is open.
Thanks very much. My question's for Mr. Lavero. What does it mean from a contractual perspective to label this a high-visibility close call? And are there going to be any spillover impacts to the schedule for the SpaceX Demo 2 flight? Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Irene. Great question. So there's no specific contractual implications. Obviously, when we bring in the team to go ahead and do the required organizational root cause investigation, there will be impacts on both the Boeing side and the NASA side. But it is a process of looking at a lot of the stuff that has already been looked at on the Boeing side and some of the stuff that was already looked at on our side as well. So I'm not saying there won't be extra work connected to it, but there's no particular contractual issue that I'm aware of. Kathy may want to correct me on that, or Jim may want to correct me on that. But as far as I know, there's no contractual issue to it. In terms of the SpaceX demonstration, there's no known crossover to the SpaceX demonstration at this point. When the team comes in, if they identify something that perhaps we NASA did on the Starliner effort, which may have been replicated on the other side of the issue, certainly we will go look at that. But I don't foresee any real impact out of this to the SpaceX schedule.
Thank you. Next, we have Stephen Clark from Spaceflight Now. Your line is open.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. A question on if an OFT-2 is required, maybe for Doug Lavero, based on the firm fixed price contract that Boeing has with NASA. Is the entire cost of that on Boeing if an OFT-2 mission is required? And any projection on how long it might take Boeing to come back to NASA with a plan for NASA to review to decide whether another uncrewed flight is required before CFT? Thank you.
Steve, I don't want to get into the contractual implications of how we handle that. That's still an issue that the government and Boeing would have to work out in the future, and it wouldn't be proper. We haven't had that detailed discussion yet. It wouldn't be proper for me to talk about that at this issue. And I do apologize, Steve. My attention was pulled away on the second part of your question. Could you repeat the second part?
Hold on one moment. Let me open his line.
Sure. Steve, can you repeat that second part, please?
Steve, your line is open.
Yes, thank you. Doug, you mentioned a few minutes ago that Boeing is going to come back to NASA with sort of a plan forward to how to address these corrective actions, and NASA evaluates that. What's the timetable for that deliverable coming out of the IRT, and how long will it take NASA to review that and decide whether an OFT-2 mission is required, and any chance that could be this year? Thank you.
Sure. So, Steve, as I said earlier, I don't know what the time scale will be once we see the Boeing plan, because it will be somewhat dependent on the Boeing plan. But let me ask Kathy and John to answer when we expect to see that plan come back, because I do not know that right now. Kathy?
So we're shooting for the end of the month to have a review between ourselves and Boeing with their initial plan to be able to bring that up to you, Doug. So.
Great.
Thank you. Next, we have Marcia Dunn from the AP. Your line is open.
Yes, thank you. For another question for you, Doug, could you talk about the pros and cons of ordering another uncrewed test flight, and what will you be looking at in the coming month or two or three in order to decide which way to go on this issue?
Yeah, Marcia, I apologize for not being able to give you more details than I've given you, only really because it's hard for me to hypothesize exactly what I'll be looking for, not at least having the ability to actually look at Boeing's plan right now. Clearly we'll be looking at some things that you can easily understand. We'll be looking to make sure, A, that they have truly done and gone back and re-looked and retested all the necessary software that they have, and I think John Mulholland spoke both on this telecon and one last week to the complete job that they're looking at doing. So clearly we will want to validate independently that they will have done that. We will look at all of the other recommendations from the IRT, the 61 findings and corrective actions. We will look at each of their resolution plans for that. But at the end of the day, what we have got to decide is, based upon the work that Boeing will do we have enough confidence to say we are ready to fly with a crew, or do we believe that we need another uncrewed test? And it's difficult for me. I hope you'll excuse it, but it's difficult for me to tell you what the pros and cons are, because it's more than just a simple balance scheme, right? It's a very complex system, and it's a very complex way to address it. I wish I could tell you that, but it's not a math equation. It's a detailed a detailed engineering look that we're going to have to go ahead and do. As soon as we come to that conclusion, one way or the other, we will share that. We will share that with you and make sure that you understand the basis of our reasoning. I just can't give you that today. I apologize.
Thank you. Next, we have Bill Harwood from CBS News. Your line is open.
Thank you, and thanks for doing this, folks. Just a little follow-up for Doug, and maybe this is one you can answer. Our understanding of the requirement for OFT-1, one of those was to rendezvous and dock with the space station. So I guess my question is, what is the actual requirement? In other words, I'm wondering what you would have to say we don't need to do that before we put a crew on board, since that did not get done in OFT-1, which we thought, or I thought anyway, was a requirement. So how would you have a rationale, or could you develop a rationale that would say we don't need to do that and we can press ahead with the crew flight? I'm not asking you which one you're going to do, just how do you guide that is what I'm wondering. Thanks.
Sure. Great question, Bill, and I'll answer part of it, and then I'll turn it over to Kathy and John and Jim to see if they can fill in things that I don't know. So first of all, it was a negotiated requirement on the Boeing contract that in order to demonstrate they were ready to fly with a crew, that they would do a docking demonstration. So let me make sure I break that apart. It was not an original government requirement that you must do a docking demonstration. The original government requirement said, tell us how you're going to go ahead and give us the confidence that we can safely fly a crew. And Boeing's proposal came back and said, we propose to do that through an actual docking mission, and then the government captured that proposal in a contract for Boeing that says, fine, you've promised to do a docking mission, we will hold you to that promise. Boeing could have come back at that time and said, we don't propose to do a docking mission, but we propose to do these 10 things instead. And had we gone ahead and decided that was sufficient, we would have then written the contract to cover those 10 things. So there are ways to do it without going ahead and doing docking. That has to be part of Boeing's proposed plan forward. If they propose not to do an actual docking, then they have to show us instead through technical details why their alternative plan would work and would be just as good as a docking. Let me give you a for instance on that. And you said, how could you fly safely without a crew, or with a crew if you haven't done that already? So let me give you a for instance that we were talking about just the other day. There's a condition that can happen during docking where the spacecraft gets stuck in between docking, where it's not fully hard docked to the station, nor is it fully free of the station. And when that happens, it means that the astronauts can't transfer over to the station, and the spaceship can't go ahead and separate itself from the station. So you could imagine that could be quite hazardous. So one of the things that Kathy and her team have been working on, even had we had a successful OFT, is if we entered that situation, what would be our plan to go ahead and then separate the capsule from the space station? We had the exact same kind of plan for shuttle when we did this with shuttle. So there's many things that we can do to provide the confidence that we can fly safely without docking. I'm not saying we will or we won't. I'm saying that Boeing will come back to us with a plan. They will propose to us whether they intend to go ahead and do another flight to dock, or they propose to do other things that give us the confidence they can do it. And we'll make sure that every decision we make is with crew safety and spacecraft safety in mind. And let me open it back up now to Kathy or Jim or John to fill in what I may have missed.
Oh, I thought that was a great answer. You know, the only thing I'd add is, Bill, I think we're looking at what's the best way for us to get to crewed flight, right? Understanding what we did and didn't learn on OFT, right? Doug was exactly right. You know, our original government requirement was for one crewed flight test, and then each of the proposers were able to propose how they would get there, and Boeing had proposed to one of the steps along the way was with an uncrewed demonstration mission. We conducted an uncrewed demonstration mission that met some of the objectives, but not all the objectives, like you pointed out. And now they have to talk about what is their path to get to crewed flight. And we are working together on what other mitigations could be put into place to get there, because really our ultimate goal is how to get to crewed flight and PCMs as quickly as possible, understanding that we can't jeopardize crew safety.
This is Jim Chilton. For us, it's not that complicated. Boeing stands ready to repeat an OFT. We are keenly interested in NASA's risk assessment, just like we want to know their opinions and their recommendations and requirements out of the IRT. So there's not any intent on our part to avoid it, not do it. We stand ready to do it. We just want to make sure that whatever we fly next is aligned with NASA's with preferences, and of course all of us want crew safety number one.
Thank you. Next we have Joey Roulette from Reuters. Your line is open.
Hey, thanks so much for doing this. I was wondering if NASA could make public a list of the 61 corrective actions, either in full or lightly redacted. And then another question, since the IRT is sticking around on speed dial, what specific elements of Starliner are they focusing on the most moving forward? Just trying to get a sense of what is different that we didn't already know. Thanks.
Joey, this is Doug. Let me at least answer the first part of your question. And the answer is, I don't know. We haven't had that conversation with Boeing, and we'd have to have that conversation. We will, if you'll allow us, let us take that as an action to see whether or not that's something that we can make happen. And I'll leave the second part of the question to Kathy and the team that she's with.
So, obviously the IRT needs to stick around. They're still working on our third problem, which was coming up with a solution for the comm outages that we had. That's still an ongoing investigation. We're still working to fix the problem there. And then obviously to make sure from a NASA-Boeing joint team perspective to make sure that the corrective actions that John and I are putting in place are fully implemented and following the progress of that. I think that's pretty critical. And John, if you want to add anything else.
So, one of the things that I had asked of the IRT, as we're developing our specific work plans to address every action, we've been running those back through the IRT to make sure they believe we have fully captured the action. Obviously, we'll then take those to Kathy and her team, the NASA team, to make sure that they agree with the implementation. And then following the completion of those work plans for each action, I would like a review of either the IRT or a subset of the IRT and Kathy's team, obviously, to make sure that everybody agrees that we have fully incorporated those actions. And I think those are two important steps for me as we move forward.
Thank you. Next we have Kenneth Chang from the New York Times. Your line is open.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. This is about the end-to-end simulation that could have found the mission elapsed time issue. I was wondering, one, is that one of the recommendations of the IRT report to do those going forward? And secondly, why did NASA not ask to do that, to do one? Did NASA not know about Boeing breaking it up into chunks, or was it that they also thought that wouldn't bring up, that wasn't going to miss anything? Thank you.
So, one of the challenges you have is about does the box that's acting like that key component of the vehicle have the right characteristics, right? And so one of the issues we had with the mission elapsed timer was we did have in the Starliner software integration lab, there was what we call a kite box, which is kind of a simulator for the Atlas V interface. It's the interface test hardware. And unfortunately, that box didn't exactly characterize, it didn't behave like the box on the launch vehicle, right? And so people thought that we were testing with the right characterization of the hardware, but really we ended up finding after the fact that guess what? It didn't fully characterize the behavior, so we were testing with a box that didn't accurately behave like the actual flight box did. We had a very high fidelity test. It was basically our wet dress where we went and we took the actual spacecraft and the launch vehicle and did an integrated test out on the pad, ran it all the way up, but obviously, Kenneth, we didn't want to launch that day, right? And so we only went up to T-0 and didn't realize, and on it, the integrated system worked beautifully at that stage. So we felt like we did a super high fidelity test all the way up to T-0 with the actual spacecraft and launch vehicle. Everything worked fine. The team had taken using that hardware box, they had tested past the T-0 time frame all the way up into the beginning of the what are called our orbital insertion burn. So people felt like they kind of had tested that regime, but the fact that we didn't have, that the hardware wasn't fully characterizing the flight hardware was a problem for us. So one of the big actions, and I talked about it before, was going back and looking at all those boxes, all the hardware boxes that we use, and we call them emulators, and everybody doesn't understand what that means because it's NASA engineering speak, but it's what we're using to characterize. You can't bring a launch vehicle into a software integration lab. So we have to do our next best thing, and what we've got to work a little bit harder on the next time is making sure that those boxes that are really representing key pieces of hardware for us actually are behaving like the system that they're characterizing. And I don't know, John, if you want to add anything else.
Just to specifically address, Ken, your first question, yes, one of the IRT actions was to do that end-to-end simulation before we fly, both from launch to docking, and then another one to go from docking to landing.
But we also need to make sure we got the right boxes to be able to characterize that too, right?
Absolutely, and that's another one of the IRT actions, right, is to go back to all the emulators, as Kathy described, and make sure those are validated.
Thank you. Next we have Tim Fernholz from Quartz. Your line is open.
Hello, good afternoon. Good morning, I'm sorry. Thanks for taking the time for this. I just want to repeat Joey's request for a full list of the 60 recommendations of the IRT. I think that should be shared with the public, and I hope to hear about that shortly. Two questions for Doug. One is just who led the IRT from NASA's side? And can you tell me a little bit more about past examples of high visibility close calls and why you felt it was important to characterize the OFT in that category?
Sure, thank you. So from NASA's side, the gentleman's name was Bo, and Kathy, please help me with the pronunciation if I get it wrong. Bo Bedick, I believe is how to pronounce it. Go ahead.
Beamick.
Okay, thank you.
Beamick.
Thank
Yep, Bo Beamick.
Okay, so I just call him Bo, so I never learned his last name. So he led it from our side. Very experienced individual. Been working on spaceships all the way back from the days of Shuttle under Rockwell. So very strong engineer who is a consultant to our chief engineer's office under Ralph Rowe. So thank you for that. Now I have forgotten the second part of your question. I apologize. Can you so if you can repeat that, please.
1 second. Let me open his line again. And Tim, your line is open.
Hey, sorry. I was just asking about the high visibility close call designation, the history of that, and why you felt it was important. Thanks.
Yep. Got it. So, you know, there's two reasons. Number one, there's a regulation, NASA regulation 8125, I think. I can look at it for you. That kind of tells us what we're supposed to do when. And it wasn't apparent when we first started, when we first were at the OFT, 8621.1C. So it wasn't apparent when we began into this incident after the problem with the Met timer at the beginning, and then the evolving nature of the correction in the deorbit. It wasn't apparent at the beginning that any of those individually met the conditions that were necessary for us by regulation to go ahead and call this a high visibility close call. And it wasn't until really I got the full out brief from the IRT and I looked over the compilation of everything that had occurred that I said, you know, if I'm sticking by the letter of the law, and I believe it's my responsibility to do so, I really need to go ahead and issue a high visibility close call. So we did. And that kicks off a process that looks, like I said, it looks everywhere in the system up to my desk to find out what should we have done better, or where do we need to learn lessons, or whatever it is. So I take that responsibility very seriously. In terms of which ones have been done in the where have we done in the past, I don't know the answer to that question. What I can tell you is immediately outside my door is a wall chart with every incident that has happened in human spaceflight, both Russian and U.S. and other nations. Every incident that's happened in human spaceflight, and they all fit into one of these categories: high vis close call, loss of mission, at the worst of it, loss of crew, all specified in our regulation. And I think it was one evening when I was looking at that chart that I said, you know, what happened here needs to be captured, so that future leaders will have the benefit of our hindsight. So those two things, both the regulatory requirement that I do it, and more what I would call the fact that my stomach, looking at that chart, says this needs to be done. It's the right thing to do. Those are the two things that led me to make that call.
Thank you. Next, we have Marina Corin from The Atlantic. Your line is open.
Hi, thank you for going over some of the corrective actions that Boeing is going to make moving forward, and I do hope we get the full list soon. I'm wondering if there's any corrective actions that NASA will be taking for itself. Outside of the reviews that are going on, is the commercial crew program making any changes in terms of oversight or process in terms of managing Boeing?
Doug, can I take that?
Please do, Kathy.
Okay, so I mentioned a few of them in my opening statement. You know, one of the areas that we've been working with Boeing, and Boeing's been very open to us further engaging in their software development process. So we are specifically adding a focused software lead on the Boeing software, we've added a couple of folks over in their software development process. We are beefing up support on both their software review boards and their overall engineering review boards that Doug had talked about. And then in addition, we've been working with Boeing on, we have, NASA has IVMV, our independent software verification capability, and we are working with Boeing on adding NASA IVMV work to help them assess their software also. So those are all kind of key areas that we're already working with Boeing on and implementing right now.
Thank you. And one moment. We have Chabeli Carazana from Orlando Sentinel. Your line is open.
Hi, all. Thanks so much for doing this. I have a question sort of expanding on what Tim Chang said. Boeing previously said that its approach to verification isn't specific to Boeing. Other companies test in a similar way. So I'm wondering if, since you're requiring Boeing to now perform this full end-to-end test, whether you're also going to make that a requirement moving forward for SpaceX or for other programs.
Kathy, you want to take that?
Yeah. I mean, our goal is always to perform end-to-end tests. The issue we'd had previously was how the test was performed and in the segments that it was performed, right? And so, yes, we are working with both SpaceX and Boeing on reevaluating where our end-to-end tests are and making sure we're satisfied with the hardware that's conducting the testing and how the testing is being conducted.
Thank you. Next, we have Marcia Smith from SpacePolicyOnline.com. Your line is open.
Thanks so much. My question, I think, is to Doug. You were talking about the high visibility close call and looking at that wall outside your office and how concerned all of this made you become. And I'm just curious, with all this happening at the same time, you're looking at new arrangements with companies for the human landing system. How is what you're learning from this going to inform how you write the agreements for the human landing system? Do you think it's going to change your approach to it? Are you going to require, for example, that there be these independent review teams if there's any major anomaly? Or how do you see it fitting in with NASA's longer-term plans to use these kinds of agreements?
Marcia, great question. And as you could easily predict, absolutely, we're gonna roll these lessons back into our human landing system contracts and requirements. Again, the documents that Boeing has provided that are both non-proprietary, we will go ahead and make sure all of our HLS contractors have them. Kathy and her team, and Kathy, for example, told you some of the things that she's doing internally. We will make sure that if there are any gaps in the way we were managing, that we will assure those gaps don't exist on the HLS side. So there is no question that we will change how it was planned to manage HLS with the knowledge that we got from that, and that's not unusual. Even if this specific incident had not occurred, we got smarter between the COTS contract and the commercial crew contract. The commercial crew contract has made us smarter on what happens when we have this government industry commercial relationship, and so we already had factored some of that learning into the way we wrote those contracts. They're not a mirror image of the CCP contracts, and everything we've done to date and everything we'll learn from this incident, we will roll back into the team, the Marshall team, that is executing those contracts. From a big picture perspective, Marcia, if I could, I'll tell you, I think we're going to make sure that there is probably more prescribed testing and prescribed kinds of testing in HLS than perhaps was written down in the documents. That was not a firm government requirement at the time. Anyway, the way the HLS contracts occur is we go ahead and pick the winners, and then we're intending to spend 3 months with them in an intensive process figuring out how we're going to validate all the requirements and make sure all the operations leading up to human landing were done safely. This knowledge that Kathy and her team and the Boeing team are providing us will just make us all the much better at that.
Thank you. Next we have Brendan Byrne from WMFE. Your line is open.
Yeah, I think that this will be for Doug. I just want to echo kind of Tim's question. I think having some historical context of the high visibility close call would be good. But do you foresee that these kind of audits that you're doing, do you foresee any impact on changes in the way you work with other commercial partners in the future, like SpaceX or commercial cargo partners?
It's hard for me to say sitting here today what those changes would be, and certainly a lot of this has to do with perhaps my management style from other people's management style. I've been working with commercial partners in space for many, many years. I think I understand a lot of the strengths of those relationships, and they have some very significant strengths. And I think I understand some of the dangers. This incident today adds to my understanding of that and how we as a government work. I couldn't pick out specifics of the way we will act differently today. I don't think that we've internalized that yet. But certainly, the relationship that we've had for 50 years with contractors like our Boeing teammates here, like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, whomever that may be, that relationship is certainly one that we had built up over many, many years, but it wasn't necessarily the right relationship for the nation. Going forward, we have different kinds of suppliers today, and I do not believe there's anything inherently more or less dangerous with the new supplier relationships. But we continue to learn how to make them better all the time, and so this will definitely, I think, allow us to be stronger as we go forward. And I think that's important because we're going to rely on these kind of these great firms that are out there, whether they're old in the commercial business, if I can say that, folks like SpaceX and Blue Origin, or newer in the commercial business for space like Boeing. We will become better customers through the experiences that we've had here and on prior commercial efforts.
Our next question will come from Morgan McFall Jensen from Business Insider. Your line is open.
Hi, thanks so much for organizing this call. This question is for Doug. You mentioned a new organizational assessment of NASA itself. What will that look like, and who will be conducting it?
So, what happens after we do the high-vis close call? The team is put together by our safety office in concert with my office and others. To tell you the truth, I've never been through the process before, so I can't tell you exactly how it all comes together. But I spoke with our head of safety yesterday about this, and we will go ahead and bring forward a team lead to do that. It's not an organizational safety assessment. It's an organizational root cause assessment. So I want to be clear. What it tries to do is it tries to go ahead and understand the organizational elements of what may have caused the incident that we see, and are there fixes to it. So it's not trying to go ahead and decide if we have the right safety culture. I can tell you for sure, since I've been here, I've seen nothing but an incredible safety culture here at NASA. It's really to say, are we organized correctly in order to go ahead and do this? And were some of those organizational issues, whether those are tiny organizational issues or big organizational issues, did they contribute, and are they part of the root cause corrective actions that we needed to do?
Our next question will come from Rachel Joy from Florida Today. Your line is open.
Hi there, Doug. I just wanted to dive into this high visibility close call just a smidge more. I know you said that you don't have maybe, past examples, but you definitely make it sound like this wasn't an easy decision for you. You're talking about it, doing the right thing. So can you just give us a sense of how serious that kind of issuing is? Is it, have you done them a couple of times? Have they been done 500 times? Just some sense of how serious is that issuing of a high visibility call?
Sure. So I can give you a little bit of a sense, but I probably can't answer your question exactly because I don't know the answer, which is I just don't know how many times this has been done in the past. What I can tell you is it's the lowest level of call that we make in something like this. So we have, it's not even in the mishap category. We have like 3 or 4 categories of mishaps, and it's not even in the mishap category. It's in this other category that we call the close call category. And a high visibility close call, quite frankly, is defined as one. It's a close call which has high visibility. It's pretty it's pretty easy to understand, and I think we can all agree that this was a close call. We could have lost a spacecraft twice during this mission. We could have lost it at the beginning of the mission. Thankfully, the spacecraft was well enough designed, and the controllers at Johnson well enough trained that we were able to recover it. And we could have lost it at the end of the mission, but thankfully the Boeing guys were able to go through the software, and the Johnson guys were able to test it and find the errors. So it's clearly a close call, and it certainly was high visibility, so that kind of makes it almost an easy call to make for me. But I did want to make sure that under the regulation it fit the category. A little bit unusual because this wasn't really a NASA mission per se. It's a Boeing test flight, so it's a little bit different contractually about how we look at this. But when I again taking the entire universe of everything we've learned and looking at where we were in the process, it seemed to me that it was the right thing to do. If you'll give us a chance to do some homework, we'll try to go ahead and find out for you how often this has been done in the past. I just don't have that information today.
Our next question will come from Eric Berger with ARS Technica. Your line is open.
Hi, good morning or early afternoon. Thanks for doing this. A question for Doug. There's been some debate in HR 5666 about, fixed price versus cost plus contracts. I'm just wondering, whether this issue, since it seems to have fallen through the cracks, between, did Boeing, with response to the software issues, NASA caught it? I would imagine there may be some pressure from people to say, well, this would not have been caught in a cost plus, or this would have been caught in a cost plus contract. So could maybe you talk about whether this has changed your philosophy at all versus the value of cost plus versus fixed price contracts? Thank you.
Sure, great question. So a lot of people ask that question, and let me tell you, I've been doing government contracting for 40 years. I have used every form of contract. There are no contract is immune from errors. No kind of contract is immune from errors. And what I do when I look at a contract and the requirements we have, I try to make sure we structure the type of contract, which would be in this case fixed price versus cost plus, the incentives on the contract, award fee, incentive fee, those kind of things, the oversight profile that we have, whether or not we go ahead and use small teams or large teams, whether they're embedded with the contract or not, and probably 20 other items. And what I have always told folks is you cannot just look at one thing in an acquisition and say oh, it's the problem with a fixed price or it's the problem with a cost plus. You have to look at all of the elements that make up what's called the acquisition strategy, all of the things you decide to put in place. I will tell you, I have had some famously successful programs under fixed price, things that we take to war, and they've been famously successful. I've had some famously successful things under cost plus, and I've had disasters under both of them as well. I'm not characterizing this as a disaster. I'm just telling you, no contract type is immune from failure. What we have to do is make sure that we match the right pieces, the right oversight, the right incentives, the right contract structure, the right payment plan, the right testing plan. We have to marry those together to create a tight web that ensures success. I don't believe it was the fixed price nature of this contract that led to this. I think it was the way we chose to manage it instead, which may not have been married to well enough to the fixed price, and may not have been married well enough to our teammates, Boeing in this case. So it's not. I don't want to go ahead and suggest that any type of contract is superior to the other. It's not. It's all of the decisions you make and how to acquire that lead to a successful result.
Hi, Nichelle. I believe we can go now to, we have time for just a few more questions, but we'll go back to Keith Cowling, who I think we lost connection to the call momentarily during it, so going back to Keith for a follow-up.
Our next question will come from Keith Cowling with NASAWatch.com. Your line's open.
The real question, and I'm getting feedback now, the real question I had to do with the fact that now Boeing has this list of 61 things. They have some sort of kit that they're taking to other parts of their organization. If Boeing was launching what they thought, a perfectly good spaceship after all the tests done beforehand, and this is the result, looking at the SLS, which is a much larger, more complex spacecraft, also built by Boeing, one would expect there would be some impact on the existing schedule. Has that been thought out yet? Is there any known impact on the schedule? And if there's an additional cost, who picks up the cost?
Keith, was that a question to me? This is Doug.
If you'd like to answer it, yes.
Well, so I'll answer, and I think Jim probably will answer from his perspective. Right now, there is no impact to the SLS schedule from this that we know about. Obviously, the translation of 61 corrective actions to actual plans has not been completely done for SLS. So all of the lessons are being shared with SLS, and the SLS guys will then go ahead and find out if there's any extra work that they need to do. In general, the things that are pacing the SLS schedule are not software issues, and we have a very complete NASA-owned software integration lab, which, as many folks on this call have asked, where we can do end-to-end testing between all the avionics in the rocket and all of the flight software in the spacecraft. So we maintain that laboratory, which actually has the actual hardware boxes. It's all done at Marshall, integrated together. If we find some common issues in how we develop software and we want to go test them, we can do that. Certainly, we're telling the software guys there, make sure they cover all the logical test conditions. I spoke about that earlier today, and we'll assure that we do that. But there is the pacing items on SLS launch right now are really getting through green run, doing all of our engine testing, movement to Kennedy, erection at Kennedy. Software is not our pacing item, with one minor exception. I don't want to go ahead and leave anybody with a false impression. We have a piece of test equipment called a stage controller at Stennis, which we still have to finish the software for, and it is one of the issues that we're tracking on a routine basis. It's not the same kind of flight software issue that you talked about here, but it's an issue of actually building that software for the stage controller. But in general, it's the hardware flow on SLS that's dictating the schedule, not the software flow. Jim, did I say that right from your perspective? You got anything else to add?
We did. Thank you, Doug. I don't have anything else to say on schedule. I will say from a learning standpoint, Keith, I'll try to be maybe more complete than you want. That way you can judge for yourself whether we're going deep enough. From a software perspective in Boeing, we're making what we've learned here and been taught by the IRT, all the discoveries available. In those 61 actions and their recommendations, which become actions for the 3 things there are, those become their own issue that you've got to fix. We have taken those to NASA and are making them available to other people in the space ecosystem. I would tell you in Boeing, I'll be specific to my space and launch portfolio, we have taken those to every program, both our commercial satellites, our government satellites, all our other NASA work, and we have required those teams to implement these changes, meaning the kind of the guardrails of what they're free to choose. We've implemented those, and we're not asking for any consideration anywhere. We're trying to get better, and we're trying to help other people in the industry get better. And I'll be a little bit specific on end-to-end. That keeps coming up. We're looking at end-to-end as we remind those teams what the guardrails are. There's 3 dimensions of that at least. One is end-to-end in time, from the time you maybe power up a launch vehicle all the way to get docked at the station and power off your spacecraft, or from station to the ground. So you need to be end-to-end in time, and that was clearly a place where our teams made a choice here to do that in pieces that we in hindsight don't like. We need to be end-to-end in hardware. Ms. Luters talked about that a little bit. We want to know that the avionics all the way from the launch vehicle to station has all touched each other to the best we can test that through Starliner and all our other systems. And we want to be end-to-end in the software logical test conditions. We want to make sure we don't just test the stressing or bounding conditions like one might with a hardware subsystem. We want to make sure that we touch all the points that the software may have to operate in, so we exercise all of it. So, kind of in summary, we're implementing this everywhere. We're not asking for consideration anywhere. We want to be as helpful as we can to NASA and anyone else engaged in this kind of work transparently, and we're trying to make sure we go end-to-end in time, in hardware, and in the software logic conditions.
All right, we have time for one more question from Irene Klotz, and then we'll open up to our speakers for final comments, and then we'll close out for today.
Our last question comes from Irene Klotz from Aviation Weekly. Your line is open.
Thanks very much. 2 quick ones. One for Mr. Lavero. What is the status of the purchase of additional Soyuz seats to help bridge a potential gap or shortfall in U.S. staffing on the station? And for Mr. Chilton, you mentioned some of the Boeing space programs, but are there any, I was wondering if there's any spillover from this or the analysis that will affect the ongoing 737 MAX work that the company's been doing. Thank you.
Irene, thanks. We're in negotiation with our Russian partners on the extra seats. Irene, our intention right now is to purchase a single seat for that. Obviously, we will reevaluate as we go through all of the SpaceX and Boeing flight tests. But right now, we're still in negotiation with them.
Ms. Klotz, this is Jim Chilton. In responsive to your question, I think you were asking, are we going beyond the space programs with these learnings? Certainly. We have what we consider a strong, and in fact we are strengthening our central and core engineering organizations, both around software and other things. These learnings have been fed to those teams, and I know are being applied across our enterprise. I'm not aware of anything common or relevant to 737 MAX out of this.
And thanks, Mr. Chilton. And I'd like to finish up today with some maybe closing comments, and then we'll end today's call.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks everybody who's been on this call. This is, I thought, been a great conversation and some great questions from all of you. I want to make sure that everybody understands we at NASA are taking this very seriously. We're applying applying all of the principles that myself and our entire team has learned from this incident and from our history in space flight to this problem. And we're going to make sure that at the end of the day, we can fly astronauts safely on Starliner, because that's what we think is the right thing to happen. I want to one more time thank Boeing for all of the hard work they've put in this. Jim has been a great partner, and John has been a great partner to Kathy on this. That partnership doesn't mean we give them a free pass. Partnership means that we work this together, but we all know that at the end of the day, we will have an absolute secure knowledge that we have done everything that's necessary to tell our crews that they can safely get on our vehicle. And that's our promise to you, and that's our promise to the American public. So thank you very much.
This concludes the conference. All participants may disconnect at this time. Thank you.